thank you all for coming to this campus conversation on House Bill 327. It is really important. So whether you agree with what is being called critical race theory or not, the point of us having this discussion is to get some knowledge about critical race theory and some other things that this legislation will impact. Because the important thing about higher education, any education, right, is to have critical thought. And so to block critical thought doesn't mean groupthink. It means critical thought, to have your mind, to understand all the dynamics and make your own decision. So it's going to be an important night, important conversation. Please put your questions in the chat. We will get to as many as we can after all the panelists have been presented. And we're going to get right started. I'm going to introduce all of our panelists. So we have Professor Mary Leah Reiter, Dr. Jennifer Nardone, Professor Paul Cook, Dr. Irene Petten, and Professor Tom Shanahan, and they will come in that order. And then we will all come back for the Q&A portion of tonight's event. So Mary.
Hi, thank you. I'm just going to start off talking about a little bit about what critical race theory is. I am probably a small member of a small handful of professors that actually teaches critical race theory. I teach it in Law and Society, and I counted that it amounts to about 3 pages out of my 600-page textbook. I also teach an upper-level sociology of law class at OSU. We spend about an hour discussing critical race theory in our class, and it is an upper-level advanced law school course at OSU. And I just had a short discussion with the professor that teaches at the critical race class at OSU. I think that politicians and conservative activists have borrowed the name of critical race theory, which is a socio-legal academic framework, and they are inaccurately applying it to a range of ideas and materials related to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in order to justify educational gag orders. Critical race theory, again, is a socio-legal framework used to explain how the legal system maintains and perpetuates a system of institutional racism in the United States. And it's characterized by a common set of tools for doing so. So I'm going to introduce you to this common set of tools and just talk really briefly about what they are. I only have 10 minutes, and it's a complicated, nuanced theory, so I'm going to go a little bit fast. One of the first commonalities that you see in critical race theory is the idea of nonlinear racial progress. So critical race theorists reject the idea that the history of race relations, is a history in the United States of linear uplift and improvement and continuous progress. Instead, we see backlash, advancement and retrenchment, progress and backlash, and that characterizes the way our legal system operates. A second commonality is the idea of endemic racism. They argue that racism is really locked in to the architecture of our society. It's normal, it's ordinary, it's a part of everyday life. In fact, it is so embedded into our fight against racism that to fight against racism is to be seen as anti-American. I think we kind of heard that rhetoric on numerous occasions with Colin Kaepernick's silent kneeling at the Black Lives Matter for Black Lives Matters in the football games and stuff like that. Another commonality is the idea of interest convergence. So interest convergence is the idea that racism advances both the interests of white elites materially, money, and working class whites psychologically. So there are large segments of society that have little incentive to eradicate it. And the result is that reform and retrenchment become defining aspects of how American law and politics works. Another commonality is the idea that race is socially constructed, that it is not a biological fixed category. Society manipulates, and the law defines and retires and creates new racial categories whenever it's convenient. The focus on skin color, hair texture, genetic differences are really dwarfed by what we have in common. Let me get here, social construction of race. Finally, or not finally, but included is the idea of a skepticism of claims of neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, and meritocracy. So these kind of ideas present race as something that's completely devoid of social meaning. It tells an ahistorical story of racial inequality as a series of kind of randomly occurring intentional individual acts. Critical race theorists reject two ideas. One is that color blindness necessarily produces racial neutrality. And the second is that color consciousness produces racial preference. So critical race theorists argue that law constructs race. It helps us determine racial categories. It sets forth criteria and rules and gives social meaning to those categories in order to structure hierarchical arrangements. And these legal arrangements, in turn, have functioned to confirm the social meanings that the law helped to create. Systemic racism is another commonality. This is the idea that racism has contributed to all of our contemporary manifestations of group advantage and disadvantage along racial lines, including differences in income, imprisonment, health, housing, education, and political representation, military service. And these differences aren't the result of individual agency and merit. We are born into a society that's structured hierarchically, and we inherit those disadvantages and those advantages. And this is economic, and it's cultural, and it's ideological, and it structures our life chances. The voice of color thesis in critical race theory is the idea that you recognize the experiential knowledge of people of color in analyzing the law and society. So minority status brings a presumed competence to speak about race and racism in the legal system. Black and brown writers are encouraged to recount their experiences with racism in the legal system and to apply their perspective to the law's dominant narratives. Critical race theory is also interdisciplinary. Critical race theory borrows ideas from several traditions, including liberalism, the law and society movement, feminism, Marxism, post-structuralism, critical legal studies, and it also crosses over into other disciplines like health, education, economics, geography, mental health, addiction, etc. A more recent development in critical race theory is the idea of differential racialization. And this analysis really draws attention to the way that society racializes different minority groups at different times in response to shifting needs of the labor market. Racial stereotypes change in order to facilitate society getting what it wants from the group. So theorists consider what the stereotypes are for different racial groups and how those stereotypes benefit the dominant group. Critical race theory is also an intersectional theory. Everybody has potentially conflicting, overlapping identities and loyalties and allegiances. This idea was really developed by Crenshaw, who noted that, for example, Black women have no independent specific protection from employment discrimination under the 14th Amendment. If you file a lawsuit as a Black woman and there are Black men working, you lose on race. If you file a lawsuit as a Black woman and there are white women still working, you lose on gender. So critical race theorists, to them, the goal is to eliminate all of these systems of inequality, hierarchy, and oppression, gender-based, class-based, sexual orientation-based, gender identity, disability, age, that they challenge the hierarchy itself, especially hierarchy based on ascribed characteristics. There is a top and a bottom to discrimination, and what it gives one group, it takes away or denies from another. And then the last element or commonality in critical race theorist types of analyses is the idea of praxis. Critical race theorists want to create change. They work towards making the world a better place. They put theory into action. So it is about actually realizing the goals of the Enlightenment, the promise of our nation, achieving equality and justice in society, working to make the world a better place. We have seen on a number of examples attacks on critical race theory recently. These attacks are really, they come from very well-funded groups. And I think that we're going to have some more discussions with upcoming speakers about how what the progress has been on the legislation, where it came from. So I'm going to leave that for later speakers, and I will end my presentation and pass it on to Jennifer. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks, Royce, for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion with my wonderful colleagues. I am not a legal historian or a legal scholar. I am an American historian. We know critical race theory is not being taught in K through 12 schools because it's a graduate level legal studies methodology, as Mary just pointed out. The fundamental questions raised by CRT are historical questions. Why didn't the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, and other legislation intended to counter racial inequality have its desired effect? Why does inequality remain despite these efforts? Why does inequality remain intact? That's a historical question, asked in this case by lawyers and legal scholars. Historians work with the central questions of CRT, but I want to be clear here in the beginning that there is nowhere to go in American history that isn't related to race and slavery and racism. It permeates our history and as a result shapes our present. In many ways, the anti-CRT legislation is telling history teachers in particular that they cannot acknowledge their subject at all. There is no history, or at least there's no history of racism to explain Ferguson in 2015, Charlottesville in 2017, and Columbus, Ohio in May of 2020. There is, of course, a history behind all of these events and history behind this latest moral panic over how we teach, think, and talk about American history. On October 14th, 2019, in recognition of the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans arriving in the British colonies in North America, Jamestown, Virginia to be specific, the New York Times Magazine dropped the 1619 Project on us. Edited by esteemed journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, the collection of articles, poetry and prose, and visual art immediately sparked intense public dialogue in response to this reframing of the origins of American freedom. In her opening essay, America Wasn't a Democracy Until Black Americans Made It One, Hannah-Jones explained that the project, quote, aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the United States narrative. In doing so, the 1619 Project challenges the longstanding, traditional, dominant, however you want to think about it, narrative of American history. It challenges a narrative that centers white Americans, white American men in particular, and even more specifically, white American men with economic and political power. Hannah-Jones argues that American freedom was defined in the context of slavery. There is no concept of freedom in our country outside of the slavery in which it was forged. American freedom was not defined in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, but in 1619, because the absence of freedom starts coming into focus in 1619. It'll be a few decades before colonial state and legal systems clearly delineate whiteness as freedom and Blackness as unfreedom, with the most extreme point on that spectrum being enslavement. That process, however, began in 1619. The argument here in the 1619 Project is relatively simple. Slavery is the central component of American history. Slavery had been shaping the American colonies for 150 years when the Declaration was issued in 1776. Slavery is not an aside. It's not marginal to the creation of the United States. Even after slavery formally ended in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, segregation carried on the legacy of racism, inequality, and state-sanctioned violence against African Americans. The articles in the 1619 Project bear this out, addressing everything from the appropriation of Black culture, or as Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Wesley Morris put it, why is everybody always stealing Black music? To an article by one of my favorite historians, Kevin Cruz, called How Segregation Caused Your Traffic Jam, in reference to redlining and urban renewal policies enacted by state and city governments during the mid-20th century. These policies deliberately ran highways through Black neighborhoods, intentionally devalued real estate in Black communities, and ensured African Americans could not access the same socioeconomic mobility experienced by so many white Americans following World War II. Other articles trace the legacy of slavery and some of the most acute issues facing us today: mass incarceration, lack of affordable and universal health care, and capitalism itself, and what is probably the most debated article in the collection, written by Princeton sociologist Matthew Desmond, called American Capitalism is Brutal. You can trace that to the plantation. So in that opening essay, America wasn't a democracy until Black people made it one, Nikole Hannah-Jones argued that, quote, the United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie, end quote. Slavery and freedom. We cannot separate them if we want to truly understand our history. We have to acknowledge these difficult historical realities. One of the freedoms Americans fought for during the Revolution was the freedom to enslave Black people. White Americans understood what freedom from England might look like because they definitely understood what slavery looked like. And so the project put these hard truths front and center, and in doing so challenged the mythology so deeply embedded in American identity, one that centers equality, freedom, and democracy. These are noble principles. They are real, but they were not manifested or enacted in 1776 or even in 1787 with the Constitution. When Hannah-Jones argues that America was not a democracy until Black people made it one, she means the idea of freedom and equality enshrouded in the founding documents of the country didn't actually result in the freedom and equality so enshrined in our collective identity and memory. The fundamental building block of any democracy is the right to vote. Yet we know that right was denied to African Americans and other groups well into the 20th century. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited states from denying the right to vote based on race. States found other ways to deny the vote with poll taxes, literacy tests, moral character clauses, and it would be almost 100 years before those laws were nullified by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Constitution created a framework for a democratic society. The 15th Amendment defined the most important component of that democratic society. The Voting Rights Act, 100 years later, removed loopholes in the 15th Amendment, and equally important, empowered the federal government to ensure fair and open elections. The legislation that extends protection not just to African Americans, but to all of us, was necessary because of the legacy of slavery, segregation, and disenfranchisement. There are legitimate criticisms of the 1619 Project. In December 2019, the New York Times published a letter written by several quite prominent historians criticizing the articles for overemphasizing what they called identity, and claimed Hannah-Jones overstated the centrality of slavery to American history, especially the Revolutionary and early Republic eras. A group of political scientists expressed similar concern in a letter published in Time magazine around the same time. Historians and social scientists will tell you that this is when things get really interesting. Debate, especially in good faith, is the fun part of historical inquiry. History is forged in debate, reflection, revision, and interrogation, none of which negates factual truths, like the Civil War ended in 1865, for example. What the end of the war means, however, is a process of unraveling multiple narratives and perspectives. It's a process of unearthing evidence and documentation. It's a process of analyzing that data and information into a well-supported argument, which hopefully brings us closer to understanding why that date, 1865, means anything in the first place. But the 1619 project sparked a whole lot of bad faith arguments, in addition to a general panic among many Americans, and it opened a window for Republican lawmakers to start introducing legislation that banned this kind of debate and conversation in the classroom, where it's most appropriate. In the months before the 2020 election, then President Donald Trump established the 1776 Commission in direct response to the 1619 project. The 1776 Commission consisted of conservative politicians and activists, not a historian among them, to, as Trump's executive order explained, restore patriotic education in schools. This is not so subtle coded language for history that makes Americans uncomfortable, white Americans uncomfortable. And I personally think it has more to do with making white parents uncomfortable than children and young adults. Just this year alone, lawmakers in Arkansas, Iowa, Mississippi, Missouri, and South Dakota have filed bills that would cut funding to K through 12 schools and colleges that teach lessons directly related to the 1619 project. And I should say that lesson plans were included as part of the project. So including those lessons in the classroom would punish school districts. This legislation would punish school districts and teachers that use that teaching material. And so in many ways, the 1619 project is a manifestation of the methodologies and the ideas that Mary just introduced us to. The methodologies defined by CRT are manifested in the 1619 project, and as such, should be part of our conversation about this legislation. So thank you. Irene.
Paul, first.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for such a very well formulated presentation. And I will try and follow up with some of the comments that you made. I want to thank Royce and the committee for putting this together. It's an honor for me to be here to speak on this odious and fascist bill. Now, I'm be upset by, this term fascism, but we have to face it. We have to be brave. We have to be courageous as we look at current conditions and realize that one of the cornerstones of fascism is in three parts. Number one, to fashion and control with enforcement the narrative of public discourse and education. And it puts restrictions on this public discourse and education by restricting human and democratic rights and the freedom of thought and speech that indeed threaten the existing order and the relationships that exist as a result of this existing order. Another point, and the third point in this first cornerstone of, or one of the major cornerstones of fascism, is that it parades under the cloak of ensuring a free society from all of the potential enemies that appear and operate within. Now, this bill is an example of this kind of attempt to limit and restrict public discourse, as well as education of the public. And it has some clear objectives now, because if you're able to do that, then you're able to restrict the rise in consciousness. And as a result of trying to restrict the rise in consciousness, with whatever kind of success that you may have in doing so, you restrict the thoughts and actions of people that may question the present system and critique the position of power and the status of human democratic rights within that system. In short, these restrictions attempt to curtail the movement of change in society and protect the status quo, along with a group that occupies and dominates dominant power. So, this is one of the objectives of this bill, to attempt to do that. Now, history records that this is never successful. What does this bill attempt to say? And here on the last page, page 38 of the bill, line 1070, going on 1079, going to line 1080, it says this. This is what the General Assembly has found. And let me read it verbatim from this bill. That slavery, racial discrimination under the law, and racism in general are so inconsistent with the founding principles of the United States. Now, stop there. Inconsistent with the founding principles of the United States. Slavery was written into the Constitution. Africans were indeed 3/5 of the population. And there was protection of those who owned this private property, that is, in human beings, within the Constitution. The bill goes on to say that under these principles, the United States fought a civil war to eliminate the first, meaning slavery. Now, historians today doubt this reality. This is a subjective conclusion on the part of those that are sponsoring this bill, that in some kind of way, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War actually freed Africans. Indeed, the Emancipation Proclamation freed no one, and the Civil War was not fought for the primary purpose of freeing Africans from captivity and slavery. Primarily, it was for the purpose of enthroning industrialism as the major and dominant economy inside of the United States. And then this section here in the bill also states that the United States waged long-standing political campaigns to eradicate the second, meaning racial discrimination. Now, how can this be any more than a subjective conclusion designed to fashion and control the public narrative as it relates to the rising in political consciousness and education? Because this long-standing political campaign was fought as a result of the blood of people who got beat, who went to jail, who suffered rape, who suffered dislocation, who suffered lynching. And the list of that goes on and on. And finally, they say that racism in general was rendered unacceptable in the court of public opinion. Now, racial segregation has never really been rendered unacceptable in the court of public opinion within the United States. Finally, all of this together, the bill says, is supposed to dispel the idea that the United States and its institutions are systemically racist, and that under the law, racism should not be at the center of public elementary, secondary, and post-educational institutions, which means that this society is moving away from racism, and it doesn't exist in any kind of shape, form, or fashion, let alone in a systemic fashion. Finally, in terms of what the legislature has found, in point number 2, they say that democratic societies built on the ideal of individual freedom, which means individualism, and self-driven pursuit of prosperity, which means private property, with a dedication toward equal opportunity, will thrive in perpetuity. Now, what they're saying here subjectively, is that there is American exceptionalism, the best system in the world, without all of these problems, that if we do have them, we are beginning to wither them away. And this whole question of individualism and the primacy of individual interests over the collective interests and over the interests of the whole is something that will live in perpetuity. Finally, this whole pursuit of private property which the bill states will also thrive in perpetuity, promotes then this whole question of ownership of resources within society by a very privileged few as private property. Now, if nothing else can be said about slavery, it is the epitome of the question of private property. And so this bill says, in so many words, here's what we have found to be the existence, and this American exceptionalism cannot be questioned. The bill goes on to enforce 8 things that you can teach. And you can do so as long as there are with 2 sides of objectivity. Or you can teach about the civil rights movement as long as you do it objectively and present 2 sides to it. What's impossible for me as a historian and as a teacher of American history and of African-American history, or African history in North America, as I call it, to teach this whole question of slavery, the slave trade, segregation and apartheid, the civil rights movement, from a standpoint of objectivity only, as if there's 2 sides to the question. This is impossible for me to do, but yet on lines 54 through 84 of the bill, it states these things that you can and cannot say when you're talking about these issues. And it repeats it again in lines 778, 800. Now, maybe in the question and answer period, we can look at some of these restrictions that are put on public discourse. And of course, it's enforced by pain of dismissal on the part of the individuals that are engaging in this teaching, or maybe even loss of funding to the institutions that they work with. Now, this bill is historic in the sense that it shares a common thread of evolutionary development. It is the descendant, if you will, of the old slave codes, the Black codes, and it is designed to protect, whether or not we like it or not, the power of particular groups in society and prevent education of the masses of African people in this country, as well as all people within this country. And we can date the slave codes all the way back to the 1630s, the 1700s, which codified the fact that Africans could not be exposed to reading and writing. If so, they could be punished with 39 lashes. The Black codes in the 1860s, which were nothing more than really a duplication of the old slave codes, just applied to the conditions existing after the Civil War. And then, of course, we have in Ohio, the Black codes that were written into the Constitution of the state of Ohio in 1803 and repeated on 3 additional occasions, or 2 additional occasions when the Constitution was rewritten. From 1803 to 1888, these Black codes restricting education, restricting the movements of people of African descent, were part of the state of Ohio's Constitution. And then, of course, we have all the segregationist and apartheid laws that have existed ever since the Supreme Court's decision of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, all the way up through to the civil rights movement before they were eventually challenged. Now, these laws, these codes and these laws were both de jure as well as de facto. De jure meaning written into the law, and de facto meaning that they were culturally accepted as acceptable norms and practices of society. One of the things that this bill does not confront is this whole question of cultural dominance and what is not written into the law and what is assumed to be correct and proper in terms of human and democratic rights. Well, now let's take a look at what happened historically as a result of these slave codes, as a result of these Black codes, as a result of these apartheid segregation era laws that were on the books until the 60s. What we have is a situation where these slave codes produce all kinds of rebellions inside of society. Slave rebellions in society, abolitionist movements to do away with slavery inside of the American society. Black convention movements were at the very vanguard and heart of these abolitionist movements that took place from the 1830s all the way through to the 1860s, where African communities formed conventions to talk about the strategies to eliminate this injustice from American society. And of course, what else happened was a bloody civil war. And of course, in the 1960s, massive demonstrations globally, as well as within the United States, to democratize the country, to have it live up to these principles of supposedly a racial and economic democracy inside of the United States. In the 1960s, there were massive demonstrations that were aimed at desegregating universities in the South. And I need not remind those of you who are students of history that these efforts to desegregate universities in Mississippi and in Alabama turned out to be war zones as a result of this restriction of African education and the rising consciousness. In addition, by the time we reached the 1960s and 1970s, demonstrations took place all across the United States on campuses in order to democratize the educational curricula. These demonstrations took place at OSU in Ohio, Kent State in Ohio, Jackson State in Mississippi, Cornell in New York, and in places like Ohio State University, where in 1970, demonstrations took place to democratize the educational curricula, leading to a rising consciousness of people to enable them to be able to critique American society. We ended up with 5,000 National Guard, 3,000 state police, 300 Columbus police, $400 worth of tear gas being dropped on the campus in the first day of demonstrations in May of 1970. And so this bill today, let me suggest to you for your consideration, and I hope maybe we have some time at the end to go through some of the sections of the bill, will continue to promote this kind of disruption inside of society in an effort to protect a privileged group, a privileged sector within the society, those who control capital and those within the political system who also control the making of the laws and the determination of what the public discourse will be. It will further polarization. We will have increased demonstrations and arrests, all leading to, and this may be difficult for some to accept, breakup and national war across the United States. Because if one thing that we have to prove in history, and that is as long as there is exploitation, there will be resistance. And this being a fascist bill, we can expect there to be heightened and intensified resistance in the years to come. I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor Cook. That was fantastic. I'm really appreciative to get the opportunity to be on this panel and to have these conversations. Even the conversations that we're having in preparation have been so fulfilling and enlightening. Thank you. So I'm going to start with one of the fundamental truths of sociology. The truth is that we're all born into a world that we didn't create. It's one that's already moving with ways of doing things, rules and regulations, and whole ways of life that we had no part in deciding. And we spend a lot of time trying to figure out that world. And we generally expect that that world's going to continue on without us when we die. And if we're very idealistic about it, we might even hope that we can leave things for the better. So what does that really mean? It means that what comes before undeniably shapes what is now. And at the very least, because we were born into a world that was already spinning. And this is one of the reasons why it's important to learn an accurate history. We need to know, not just because we want to offer respect to our collective ancestors, to their lives, to their struggles by knowing. It helps us understand how we've gotten to a place where groups have a better chance or a worse chance. It helps us understand now. So history obviously shapes how we do things now. It shapes how we think, how we feel. It affects our decision-making processes. It affects how we treat one another. It affects how we morally evaluate the behaviors of other people. And even though Professor Cook mentioned this already, I want to highlight one of the most important consequences and implications of this bill. There are going to be several that I discuss, but really most importantly, this is a fascist tactic for the government to engage in the process of controlling schools and teachers and to dictate the ideas that can be taught, particularly when the matter comes to history as a subject. Stalin famously stated, "Give me just one generation of youth and I'll transform the whole world." This bill has danger signs all over it. When the government is focused on crafting students as creatures of the state, it's incredibly troubling. So this is an issue that I'm sure we'll talk about in the Q&A, and most likely that our next speaker will touch on as well. But it has to be said, and it has to be said again and again and again. Interestingly, though, when you look at the bill, it seems to endorse an ideology that's quite contrary to fascism. Indeed, if you take a look at the name of it, it's the Promoting Education, Not Indoctrination Act. And we're all for that, right? It professes the desire to keep students from being subjected to partisan philosophies or from being inculcated in learning what are considered, damaging concepts. And in other versions of this bill that are found in other states, they're even referred to as divisive concepts. Now, when we look at what these concepts are, it becomes very troubling. And one of the concepts that the act would ban is the recognition, that I quote, that meritocracy is racist or sexist. To a sociologist, banning this is a really odd thought. We don't believe that a meritocracy exists and that people get ahead on the basis of their merit alone. We don't believe it because it simply doesn't exist. We don't believe it because that would suggest that there's a level playing ground and that everybody starts off equally. And that simply isn't true. And there's many other difficulties with the concept as well. But the bill would ban professors from teaching that our meritocracy, if we believe it exists, is racist and sexist. The bill's language suggests that recognizing that a meritocracy is racist or sexist would de-emphasize the importance of hard work. So where is the strong adherence to the notion that a meritocracy must exist coming from? This aspect of the bill aligns really strongly with notions of individualism, as was mentioned before, and neoliberalism that have very prominently influenced our public dialogues and public policies since the late 70s and early 80s. It came with Reagan, but it stayed, and it has bipartisan backing. So let's break those concepts down a little bit, the individualism and neoliberalism. And individualism can refer to a few things, but here it's important as it reflects a sort of freedom of thought and action. It suggests a freedom from influence as well. This means that an ideology of individualism follows this notion that people aren't really hampered by their society, right? That they're free from it. And some more extreme individualist ideas suggest that we don't even need society because we can and we should be solely responsible for our own personal well-being. So individualism might be more familiar to many of us when we think about our idea of the American dream, that I, as an individual, am able to make it on my own. I can pull myself up by my bootstraps and succeed. And by contrast, if I don't succeed, my failings are all my own. Now, individualism is an essential component in neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is effectively like the economic and political system that defends this ideology of individualism. So neoliberals favor strong protections on property rights, free functioning markets, and free trade, but they do that to help support the individual from having the best chance of getting ahead on the basis of their own merit. Now, of course, there's always that assumption of the level playing field, right? The system is set up to support people getting ahead, and that's the logic of it. And the only reason why the government would actually intervene on anything is to help them more free. And that's what this bill is an example of. It's an example of trying to help the market be more free by ensuring that students aren't encumbered by the ideas that run contrary to individualism. So if you were to suggest that meritocracy doesn't operate in practice, you're ultimately suggesting that the market can never actually really be free. And if it's not free, the government's social support role might need to expand, which is not something that neoliberals think is a good idea. And in fact, it's these ideas that led Margaret Thatcher, who's responsible for introducing neoliberal policies in the UK, to famously claim that there's no such thing as society when she was explaining why she wanted to break down governmental social supports. So the concepts of individualism and neoliberalism are so intertwined, though, with our contemporary political, economic, and social thought, and even our notions of liberty and freedom, that it can seem really odd to suggest another way might be a reasonable approach. And this is why the ideas found with the bill will just resonate with a lot of people who hear about it. The language of it will make sense on a visceral level for many people. It will pass the gut test and it will sound like it is a good idea. But obviously, if we adhere to this document, we have to effectively ignore the importance of social influence and of history and the fact that we have an unequal society, which is a really problematic as a sociologist to try to teach in this context. So doing this allows also for a pernicious form of presentism. The idea that what's happening right now is what matters and is of consequence, and that there's no past context that shapes it or affects our futures. Now, the consequences of thinking like this and acting upon it are absolutely grave for our collective futures and really the future of education. So presentism feeds into our pre-existing cognitive biases. It'll prevent us from expanding our circles of empathy so that we consider people outside of our own distinct personal groups as worthy of compassion and understanding. If you think about it, the coldest use of this logic, if a person is homeless, why should I give them assistance? They should have planned better so that they could avoid those situations. And thinking like this strengthens our boundaries of us versus them and encourages divisions. Having an us or an in-group is actually great, right? It makes us feel like we belong. It makes us feel like we're part of something. It can provide us a sense of security and emotional support. And part of having an in-group is also, however, defining who and what you are not, right? That is recognizing an out-group or them. Presentism exacerbates our likelihood of dehumanizing out-groups. We also do this interesting cognitive thing called anchoring. Generally, we talk about this in terms of how we think of probabilities, numbers. But we establish a starting point of thinking about something. And then after we hit that starting point, or after somebody gives us that starting point, we make adjustments on that basis. Now, if our starting point is everyone gets to their place in life according to their individual effort, it's going to take an awful lot of work to even think about something else. It's going to shape our idea of what's possible. And we know that on a purely positional basis, those of us with power who benefit from the status quo are much less likely to see problems with the existing system. If you're in this position, or you're looking at the world from this standpoint, you're far less likely to encounter any dissonance between how you're told the world works and how you experience the world. And if we don't prime ourselves through education to be attuned to the world from others' eyes, we may not recognize or act on any inequities. So another great tendency of humans, and part of that in-group dynamic that I was talking about earlier, is that we feel compassion for those that we love and those who are close to us. But the great part is that through reasonable and informed arguments, we've been able to expand who we feel compassion for. And this is what social movements have been really effective in doing, helping us see how the plight of people who are not us, or not immediately present, or directly related to us, are similar to us. And so education is a vital component in helping us see our future as a shared future in which we all have a stake and a responsibility. If we simply leave the conversation at, we all get where we get because that's what we deserve, it makes a shared vision for the future very, very difficult, if not impossible. And so if we think about our weaknesses as humans, right, banning important concepts in the classroom can have horrific consequences in a practical and tangible sense. If we start with an incredibly wrong anchor or prototype of an idea, it'll be harder to move away from. Since we, us, and them anyway, if we divorce context from outcome, we may dehumanize people and be less likely to recognize our similarities and more likely to engage in stereotype and even more likely to be aggressive towards one another. So there's an irony of working towards a better future. To do it, we need to recognize the past, or we fail to be able to decode the present and how the present works. We live the past every single day and we ignore it at our peril. I'm going to hand things over. Thank you very much. Over to Tom, sorry. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to start off with a quote. Our nation is deeply committed to safeguarding academic freedom, which is of transcendent value to all of us and not merely to the teachers concerned. That freedom is therefore a special concern of the First Amendment, which does not tolerate laws that cast a pall of orthodoxy over the classroom. That was written by Justice Brennan in the case of Keishian versus the Board of Regents in 1967, writing for the Supreme Court of the United States. Unfortunately, it's not 1967, and Justice Brennan has long left us. And there's been conflicting case law that, and obviously there's been an evolution in thinking. The Supreme Court has either evolved or devolved, depending on your point of view. I want to be objective, like the legislature would like. In Keishian versus the Board of Regents, the court upheld and strongly supported academic freedom as a First Amendment right of both students and teachers. In 2006 came the case of Garcetti versus Ceballar, in which the court held that public employers can discipline for teachers, or not teachers, public employees, for statements they make pursuant to their professional duties. Now, Justice Kennedy, who wrote that decision, was careful to distinguish academic freedom cases. He didn't necessarily support academic freedom. He simply said that we're not deciding an academic freedom case today. In the dissent, Justice Souter indicated that he felt this case was going to be used to limit academic freedom. And so the circuits over the years, the circuit courts of appeals around the United States have issued varying decisions. We are in the Sixth Circuit of the federal judicial system, and that sits in Cincinnati. And last year they did issue an academic freedom case. And let me read you a quote from that one. Simply put, professors at public universities retain First Amendment protections, at least when engaged in core academic functions such as teaching and scholarship. Now, that was an opinion rendered just about a year ago in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. There's an unfortunate feature of that case in that the facts are something we may not be proud of. But the Sixth Circuit did support academic freedom there. When we talk about the First Amendment and we look at it in relation to the bill that is pending, there are certain problems. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution often decides cases based upon or allows us to decide cases based upon due process of law. And there are a couple of concepts that relate to both due process and the First Amendment, and those are the doctrine of overbreadth and vagueness. And vagueness is something we need to look at. The constitutional doctrine of vagueness has to do with whether a person can determine by looking at a law what behavior is prohibited. If you don't have reasonable notice of what is prohibited, how could you be held accountable under a law? And when you start to restrict the First Amendment rights based upon vague language, and let me give you an example. Divisive concepts. Can you honestly ask yourself or tell yourself, what is it that I cannot do? Do I know what is prohibited when I hear the word divisive concepts? That's not a specific term. So to be held accountable for violating a prohibition about teaching divisive concepts certainly violates due process because you have no notice as to what's prohibited. And that is a doctrine incorporated into our Fourth Amendment, and related to it is the constitutional concept of overbreadth, which is often incorporated into the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. And overbreadth, an example would be if I am prohibited from saying something, and the First Amendment doesn't say we can say absolutely everything, but if I'm prohibited from saying something, do I know what I can say, and would that prohibition incorporate into it things I'm perfectly allowed to say? In other words, it's overbroad. Not only is certain conduct prohibited, but certainly certain perfectly legal and protected behavior could be swept into that concept. And that's what this bill does. I can honestly say I wouldn't know what exactly I cannot say if the statute says I cannot discuss divisive concepts. So those are the things we're facing. There is protection for academic freedom, especially at the college level. It is much more limited in K-12. This statute does affect colleges, public colleges in Ohio, so we should all be concerned. People ask, what about our academic freedom provision in our union contract, our teaching contract at Columbus State? So this law could abrogate that, and we have to be ready for that. So I think I would rather save time for our question and answer period and discussion. So why don't we go there?
Thank you, Tom. Thanks, everybody. If I can have all the panelists, if we can come back on screen, that would be amazing for our Q&A portion. I don't know if I can see everybody. Let's see. All right, got my gallery view. So first of all, that was amazing, everybody. Wow. I knew this was going to be a wonderful wealth of information, but you all superseded my expectations. So thank you. But I want to jump right in and say, first of all, let's think about the legislature in proposing this bill, all of which who have benefited from learning how to have critical thought in their educational process. The reason why they can write some of these things, right, is because they had in their K-12 or their college experience some teaching on critical thought and how do you form an argument, which is the very thing they benefit from that they're trying to take away from young people, older people going back to school, other people. So critical thought to me it's really the thing that they're trying to destroy, right? So one question that I have for you all, whoever wants to answer this, is that process is so important to us as educators, to our world, for our young people to understand critical thought. Why do you think that we're not having this conversation more in our hallways, in the different colleges in all over the country, in Ohio? Why I haven't heard a lot of these conversations happening in places that are going to really wreak havoc. It's going to wreak havoc on a lot of our spaces if this bill passes. Why do you think there's so much silence from the very people who should be having these conversations? Don't all jump at once. Y'all, don't make me call on somebody. Come on, like I'm in class. Don't make me call on somebody. Come on, y'all. Anybody can answer, panelists. Okay, well, I will start. Oh, does somebody speak? Okay.
Contribute something to at least, get this one started. I think that what a lot of people are thinking about these days is having to confront backlash, having to confront violence. And so there is fear that I think is a component of this, unfortunately. But one thing history does show us, at least if we look at the human and democratic rights struggle internationally and the civil rights struggle here nationally, is that people have to take courage in the face of fear. There will be additional violence. As we have seen January 6th, as we have seen with the 1776 project, beginning to hype up the population in opposition to various ideas, and really giving people the leeway or giving people the endorsement to engage in physical violence, if necessary, against ideas that should really flow free inside of society. So I think that this is one aspect of it. Others are concerned about their jobs and holding on to their jobs because this odious bill, this fascist bill, threatens people individually. It threatens institutions. People have to make a decision, a principled decision as to what to stand for, what to sacrifice for, what to speak out for, and what to go into action for. I suspect that there's going to be struggle in the future, and it may not be the kind of struggle that we anticipate, but it certainly will be a struggle. But I do anticipate there will be violence, there will be disruption in society as a result of not just bills like this, but the thinking that they try to cater to.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question in here. It says, so I see that some organizations have spoken out against this, the ACLU, OEA, OCSS. So do we expect to see our college, Columbus State leaders, cabinet, president, board of trustees to weigh in? And I would say, because we don't have any administrators on the call, that I can't answer that, but there is a forum. Dr. Harrison, Almar Walter are putting on Monday. I believe it is 10 o'clock. So that would be a question that should be asked there because we don't have administrators on, and I don't want to attempt to answer something for somebody who's not present. So Monday would probably be a good place for that question. And thank you for the question.
I think one thing to point out that hasn't been mentioned yet is that there is a part of that bill that specifically talks about college faculty. And it requires, and I have it on here, if you make me bigger, you might be able to read it, but it says that colleges will have to update their policy on faculty tenure to reflect the bill's principles and consider as a negative factor in employment and tenure decisions any confirmed reports that a faculty member or other employee knowingly or recklessly violates the bill's provisions. So this is something that will directly affect the college and the faculty. And this is in the face of when we are facing an entire revision of our curriculum to encompass DEI principles. And we teach College Credit Plus. So we have no idea how this law will impact how our faculty who go out to the high schools and teach sociology and history and political science, how are they supposed to do their job and teach the facts when there's this educational gag order? So this is something that the college has got to get on top of. We have to make, as a college and as an institution of higher education, we have to make a stand.
Absolutely. Thank you. To follow up to the first question, there was another one that said, and also I wonder how we will be supported. How will the administration handle this? Again, that's a good question for Monday. The next question is there a legitimate legal challenge to this bill if the bill passes as a violation of Ohio's Constitution, specifically freedom of speech? Is there a legitimate legal challenge?
Yes, there is. There's a legitimate legal challenge. If you pursue it through the federal courts, this isn't 1967 and Justice Brennan isn't around. I mentioned that. But Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, Justice Coney Bryant, and Justice Kavanaugh are on the bench. So how successful this will be, I don't know. The case in the Sixth Circuit from last year has bad facts. When I was in law school, a professor used to say, bad facts make bad law. In other words, a court looks at terrible facts and wants to find a way to rectify those facts, so may make bad law. And the case last year involved a Shawnee State professor who refused to acknowledge a person's gender identity in the pronouns he was using toward the student. So it was ill treatment of a student, and yet the Sixth Circuit found that that was covered by academic freedom. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, if anyone wants to rectify bad facts, they could wind up making bad law on that one.
Thank you. The next question, I think this was answered. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
If it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court right now, I suspect bad law will be made either way.
Mm-hmm. Next question was, how will this law impact our CCP partnerships? And I think that Mary kind of answered that, like we need to get on this now because it will impact us greatly. That's the answer, right? Greatly. The next question is House Bill 327 going to be on the upcoming ballot in Ohio? It doesn't have to be. I mean, it's not going to be. I don't know if anybody wanted to answer
No,
that.
it's currently in House committee in the legislature. It has not been put up for a full vote in the House. If it does pass the House, it would have to go to the Senate for a vote, and then it would go to the governor for a signature. So this is not something that citizens in Ohio are voting on. This is in our legislature. They are attempting to legislate this educational gag order. Yeah, and they've had a number of hearings, and they have had people talk in the hearings in favor of and against the legislation. It's something that we need to keep up on, and that we need to get dates and times of those hearings and participate in the process. A similar bill was just failed in Indiana, so it can be defeated. It just takes real stories from real people to show how it's problematic.
A student asks, what can students do? Well, first of all, definitely let your voice be heard. That's always appropriate. And there is something in the chat earlier. We will re-put it in because I don't know where it's at now, where you can sign up to speak next week on Tuesday and Wednesday at the State House. So we'll make sure we send that kind of information out to faculty, staff, and students, because more people might want to know what they can do. That was several people had that question. So we will definitely get that out on campus to find out where you can do things.
I have it on fairly good authority that people will get a chance to publicly express their view at the State House, whether that's inside or out, next Tuesday or Wednesday of next week.
Yes. I had another question. Why has debate seemed to become problematic, where that's a bedrock, right? Why has debate now become problematic, and groupthink has become, or seeming like it wants to become, the norm?
I'm sorry, Royce. I was just getting ready to comment on what students can do.
Oh, okay, go ahead. That's fine. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we know from history is that students have been the spark of the people's voice and of opposition, as well as promoting what they consider to be just within society. I mean, we only have to look at the SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We only have to look at, and their role as foot soldiers in the civil rights movement. In movements all over the world, it's been the young people who have begun to politically educate each other, to have discussions, to confront these issues openly, and then take to the streets. If this bill passes, which I'm afraid it will be on students to demonstrate, I think, with their feet. Only after being politically conscious of the bill, the contents of the bill, how it's going to impact them. Because I think in the end, it's going to be students more than anyone else that's going to be impacted by this bill. Mm-hmm. Yes, we professors will be. Yes, institutions will be, but it will be the students that will have to bear the brunt of this. And even those yet to be born coming to the universities that are already born to in elementary schools, in middle schools, and in high schools. And so I think that in the end, students will have to politically educate themselves, raise their consciousness, and then follow it up with action through demonstrations.
Thank you. I'm going to read the next question. So why is debate become problematic, right? Individual thoughts. Why has groupthink become the norm related to this bill?
I'll just say one thing. I'm sure someone else will be able to pick up on this. But I think it's important to reiterate what a couple of people have already said, which is these are fascist tactics. And debate is absolutely not acceptable in fascist society. An attack on education is like textbook fascist march on fascism. These are authoritarian bills. And so part of what's being attacked is like the essence of human inquiry, humanistic inquiry, which someone mentioned before as well. Empathy, sympathy, understanding the complexity of society, understanding that we can hold multiple perspectives and viewpoints, and that not everything is a both sides issue. Not everything has two sides, that there are varieties of ways that we can explain and understand the society that we live in and our identity and things like that. And good faith debate in good faith, critical thinking. Those things undermine and negate authoritarianism, which requires this groupthink. And I think as well, we have to remember that this attack on CRT, this anti-CRT stuff, is part of a much broader agenda of dismantling public education in this country that's been going on for quite some time, and also gets back to the essence of racism, and the efforts that were made after World War II to try to expand public education and address racial inequality in education is part of what has brought us here. The backlash to that is part of what has brought us here.
Thank you. So there's another question. So does this bill only apply to public institutions?
Anybody that gets funding from the state.
There are private institutions, if not most private institutions, get state, for instance, they participate in state financial aid programs. And so they would lose that funding should they not comply with this statute.
Can you add on to that? There's another question about when will this bill possibly pass?
Hopefully never, but it's in committee, and we don't know.
And the next question is Columbus State as an institution submitting testimony? And again, I'm not sure. I plan to try to go speak, whoever, somebody individually, I don't know. That would be a question for Monday. I don't know as a whole, unless somebody else knows on the call. I don't personally know.
I don't think any of us can answer that question. I'm sure the president's office can. If you need it answered before Monday, you might call the president's office and ask that very question. Anyone and everyone should maybe call and get the answer.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a lot of looking at the bill. So this question is for me. As an African-American faculty, I understand that this bill is going to impact me and people whose life experience are similar to mine. Only some of the fact, I'm a sign language interpreting teacher. So sometimes I'm just talking about my experiences and racial issues that I experienced as an interpreter, and how my students, if they are students of color, they will experience, or also their white counterparts, how to have allyship. So these things are really important to what we do as a profession. And me talking about my own personal experience, or using that to help them become better interpreters, is going to be really in jeopardy, right? Someone who just doesn't like me because of the color who I am and has to take my class can say, they said this in class. We already have so few faculty of color in higher education, period, unless you're at a HBCU. So to me, this bill is really going to do so much damage in that sense, if the institutions that people of color are at are not ready for that fight. Anybody, what do you think about that?
The standard is reckless. So if a student complains, and you are determined to be reckless in teaching a divisive concept, then the institution can lose funding and you can potentially have a tenure decision negatively impact you.
Yes.
And another issue that comes into play here is that we're relying on reports from people who are watching, who are interpreting and taking a small portion of what you've said, and then, you know, reporting out, hey, this is what's happened. And who does that generally tend to affect? That affects people of color, that affects women more so than it does affect members of the majority group. We know this with student evaluations. Student evaluations, you know, are absolutely unfavorable to people of color and women as professors. And so if we're going to use this as a standard and a basis for, you know, potentially even firing somebody, depending on what model of, you know, what punitive model that they adopt, it's highly problematic. Mm-hmm. And it won't just affect us in terms of limiting how we can help other people, right? And how we can educate them. We might find disproportionately, you know, people of color getting fired as a result of this and being fined, you know, whatever the penalty ends up being.
Yes, absolutely. And not just people of color, women as a gendered group, LGBTQI folks. So the bill has such far reaches to everyone except the white majority. Straight white majority, basically. So this is, our time is up. It's 7:28. This has been wonderful. First of all, I want to thank all my panelists so much for taking the time out to have this great discussion. Thank our interpreters, thank our faculty that are behind the scenes doing some wonderful things. Please let's not tonight be the last time you have this conversation. Have it with coworkers, have it with family, have it with friends. Doesn't mean there has to be groupthink, right? You can disagree with somebody, but the whole process of talking through it, the process of critically thinking your side of the argument or their side of the argument, or trying to see one another, that's the whole point. Let's not lose that critical thought that we are here, we should do. It is our job, right? It is what we do to make our world continue to grow, for us to continue to be free-minded people, right? Our hearts, our minds, and our souls, which if we can't, that's just a soul killer. And so I challenge you all not to let this be the last time you've had a discussion on House Bill 327 or anything like it. And I ask you to lend your voice to make sure that we can teach in all the ways that we need to teach and not limit us, because it's going to only help our society. It's going to help the next 2, 3, 4, 5 generations from what we do now. It is not just about today. It is about our forever. So thank you all. I appreciate everyone, all of you who came tonight, all the participants who signed on tonight. I thank you so much. We will get sent out some of the things that were in the chat, some of the links that were in the chat. We will make sure we get those sent out as well. So thank you all. You have a wonderful evening. And until we see each other again, good night.